There is a person in almost every group, at work, in a family, among friends, who tears up during a movie or gets emotional in the middle of a conversation that others find completely ordinary. Maybe that person is you. And if it is, you have probably spent a good portion of your life hearing things like, "You are too sensitive," or "You need to toughen up." But here's something worth sitting with. What if crying easily is not a weakness in your character, but a signal about how your nervous system, your emotional history, and your psychology are put together? That is what this is actually about. Not whether crying is good or bad, but what is genuinely happening inside the people who do it more than others, and what it tells us about the human mind. To understand this, we need to start with something called emotional sensitivity. Psychologists define emotional sensitivity as the degree to which a person picks up and responds to emotional information, both from their environment and from other people. Highly sensitive people, a term formerly studied by psychologist Elaine Aron in the 1990s, process sensory and emotional data more deeply than the average person. Brain imaging studies have supported this. When shown photos of emotional faces or scenes, the brains of highly sensitive individuals show significantly more activity in areas associated with empathy, awareness, and emotional processing. They're not imagining things more intensely, they're literally processing them more intensely. Now, crying is just one output of that processing. When emotional information comes in and it exceeds what the brain can hold quietly, tears become the release. Think of it like a pressure valve. The emotion is real, the processing is real, and the tear is simply what comes out when the system reaches its limit. This is not drama, this is biology. But sensitivity alone doesn't explain everything. There's another layer here, and it has to do with something psychologists call affect regulation, which is just a technical way of saying how well a person manages their emotional states. People who cry easily often have nervous systems that are quicker to reach what researchers call the threshold of emotional flooding. This means the gap between feeling something and being overwhelmed by it is shorter than it is for other people. That gap is not fixed. It can be influenced by genetics, early childhood experiences, chronic stress, sleep deprivation, hormonal cycles, and even diet. So when someone cries out of nowhere, it's rarely actually out of nowhere. Something internal shifted the threshold lower. This brings us to early life experiences, which are probably the most important piece of this puzzle. Developmental psychology has shown, repeatedly and clearly, that the emotional environment a child grows up in shapes how their brain learns to handle feelings. Children who grew up in households where emotions were either dismissed, "Stop crying, there's nothing to cry about," or where emotions were unpredictable and overwhelming, often develop what is called a sensitive emotional baseline. Their brains learn to stay alert, to read the emotional temperature of a room, and to respond quickly to emotional cues. That kind of wiring doesn't simply disappear in adulthood, it becomes part of how the person moves through the world. There's also something worth understanding here about attachment theory. John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth's research on attachment showed that how securely a child bonds with their primary caregivers determines a great deal about how they relate to emotions later in life. People with anxious attachment styles, those who grew up uncertain about whether their emotional needs would be met, tend to have stronger emotional reactions as adults. They cry more easily in situations involving rejection, criticism, or disconnection because those situations tap into something much older and deeper than the present moment. It's not that they're being irrational, their nervous system is responding to a pattern it learned a long time ago. Now, there is a meaningful distinction that psychology draws between crying that comes from emotional depth and crying that comes from emotional dysregulation. Both can look the same on the outside, but they are quite different internally. Emotional depth refers to the capacity to feel things fully, to be moved by beauty, by suffering, by connection, by meaning. Crying in this context is a form of processing. It comes and goes, and the person often feels better or clearer afterward. Emotional dysregulation, on the other hand, involves emotional responses that feel uncontrollable, that persist beyond what the situation seems to warrant, and that often leave the person feeling worse, not better. People dealing with dysregulation may be struggling with underlying conditions like depression, anxiety, or trauma, and in those cases, the crying is a symptom of something that needs attention, not just acknowledgement. This is a critical point because it pushes back against the oversimplification that crying easily is always healthy or always a problem. The context matters. The frequency matters. Whether it is accompanied by shame, relief, connection, or distress matters. Crying at a film because a scene touched something real in you is not the same as crying every morning before work because you feel overwhelmed by life. One is depth, the other is a signal to look closer. Psychologically speaking, one of the most interesting things about people who cry easily is their relationship with empathy. Research has consistently found that high empathy is associated with higher rates of emotional tears. Empathy involves not just understanding how someone else feels, but actually simulating that emotional state in your own nervous system. When you watch someone in pain, your brain activates some of the same circuits that would activate if you were in pain yourself. For people with strong empathy, this simulation is more vivid, more complete. So when they cry watching someone else suffer, in real life or even in fiction, they are not just being swept away by sentiment, they are genuinely experiencing a version of what that other person is experiencing. That is actually a sophisticated cognitive and emotional process. There is also a cultural and gender dimension here that cannot be ignored because it shapes how people experience and judge their own tears. In many cultures, particularly in relation to men, crying is associated with weakness, loss of control, or immaturity. This is not a psychological fact. It is a social norm, and a relatively recent and narrow one at that. Historical records show that public displays of weeping were common and even respected in ancient cultures. The Greek hero Achilles weeps multiple times in the Iliad, and it is presented as a sign of his humanity, not his weakness. Today, however, many people, especially men, but women in professional settings too, have learned to suppress their tears not because the emotion is absent, but because the social cost of showing it feels too high. The suppression does not remove the feeling, it just adds another layer on top of it, often in the form of shame. That shame deserves its own moment of examination, because it is something that people who cry easily often carry quietly. They apologize for their tears. They say things like, "I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm crying," or "I'm being ridiculous." What they're doing in that moment is distancing themselves from their own emotional response because they've absorbed the message that the response itself is inappropriate. But research in emotion science suggests that crying, when it is not suppressed or judged, actually serves a regulatory function. Studies by biochemist William Frey found that emotional tears contain stress hormones and other byproducts of elevated emotion. Crying, in this literal sense, is a way the body removes those substances. There's a reason people say they feel lighter after a good cry. It's not only psychological, there's a physical component. Of course, none of this means that all emotional expression should go unexamined. People who cry frequently sometimes notice that their tears become their primary language, a way of communicating distress that they have not yet learned to put into words. This can happen when someone grows up in an environment where verbal expression of emotion was not modeled or was even punished. Tears become a shortcut. And while tears are real and valid, relying on them exclusively can sometimes create friction in relationships or professional settings because other people do not always know how to respond. This is not about suppressing emotion. It is about expanding the vocabulary. Learning to name what you feel. I am disappointed. I feel dismissed. This matters to me more than I expected. Gives the emotional experience more precision and often reduces the sense of being overwhelmed by it. This is where therapeutic work often becomes useful. Approaches like dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, were specifically developed to help people build what psychologists call a larger window of tolerance, the range of emotional intensity within which a person can function without either shutting down or flooding. Mindfulness-based approaches also help, not by suppressing emotion, but by creating a small pause between the emotional trigger and the response. That pause is where choice lives. It does not make someone less feeling, it gives the feeling somewhere to go that is not just out through the tear ducts. People who cry easily also tend to score higher on what psychologists call openness to experience, one of the 5 major personality traits studied in personality psychology. They are more likely to be moved by art, music, literature, and nature. They often report a strong sense of meaning and connection to the world around them. They tend to notice things others miss: a shift in someone's tone of voice, a look on a stranger's face, a moment of unexpected kindness. This kind of attunement is genuinely valuable. It makes these individuals better friends, better listeners, and often more creative thinkers. The same sensitivity that makes them tear up easily is the same sensitivity that makes them deeply perceptive. So, where does this leave us? The psychology of people who cry easily is not a psychology of weakness or instability. It is the psychology of people whose nervous systems are tuned to a higher frequency. They feel more, process more, and sometimes overflow more. Whether that is a gift or a challenge depends largely on whether they have the language, the self-awareness, and the support to work with it rather than against it. The tears themselves are not the issue. They are just the most visible evidence of something happening underneath, something real, something human, and in most cases, something that deserves more curiosity than criticism.